Thank you. It's good to be with you again. Wish I could be here next week just to see that amazing illusionist. When I was a college student, I went to a large state university, nowhere near here, don't worry, and not Northwestern. But I studied comparative religion. And one of my classes on American religion, our professor had us do something which was really interesting. I won't forget it. He had us go to visit every church in this small town where the school was, but not on Sundays. He wanted us to go into those churches during the week and sit in their worship space and then write down our observations about the space. How was the seating arranged? What symbols were present or absent? What was the visual focus of the space? We would have had a field day in here. The whole point of the thing was why do they worship that way? What does it tell you about their view of God? And then I was just noticing today you guys got new speakers in here. That's different. And then the drummer, kind of contained in that little cage like he's got Ebola or something, and you don't want to get contaminated. There's all these interesting little details. So at the churches we visited, you find out there's a specific reason why the Presbyterian church had this giant soaring pulpit that reached out over the audience like a ship's prow. And there was a reason why the Episcopal Church had a baptismal font at the entrance to the sanctuary, not in the front. And there was a reason why the Catholic Church had a communion table that had no legs on it. In fact, during the 17th and 18th centuries, whole churches would split over the leg style of the communion table. There's a lot of theology around that. Here's the point of the experiment. Our professor wanted us to realize that what people think about God is reflected in the way they worship him. But more importantly, he also wanted us to realize that the way we worship God ends up informing what we think about him. It goes both ways. This is why, for example, in the Old Testament, God gives such specific instructions onto how he was to be worshiped, because he wanted his people to have a specific vision of who he was. And so he meticulously controlled the way they would worship him. So what I want to do this morning is kind of investigate, how do we think about God? And how does that reflect the way we worship him, and vice versa? How does the way we worship God end up informing the way we see him? And I want us to think about moving beyond a one-dimensional view of God, and therefore a one-dimensional view of our worship, to a fuller, more robust vision of who he is, and therefore a transformation perhaps in the way we worship him. To do that, we're going to look at a story about David in the Old Testament. In this one chapter, which covers just a few months of David's life, you see a significant transformation in his understanding of who God is, his vision of who God is, and it changes the way he worships him. We're going to look at 2 Samuel chapter 6. I encourage you to turn there in your copy of the Bible. I'm not going to read through the whole story up front. We're going to kind of work our way through it slowly, so keep it open. 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. Before we dive into that story, I need to give you some background about what happened just prior to this in chapter 5. 3 significant things happened to David in chapter 5. The first is that he sort of officially becomes king over Israel. God had called him to be king much earlier, and Samuel had anointed him with oil to be king, but there had been a battle, a feud between Saul, who was the sitting king, and David, and that is settled by chapter 5, and David finally has God's promise fulfilled to him. He becomes king. Secondly, David conquers Jerusalem and makes it his new capital, a strategically important city. And third, David battles the Philistines and God gives him victory over them. These were the most significant enemies of Israel at the time. So peace is established because of God's favor over David. So these huge things, he becomes king, Jerusalem becomes his capital, the Philistines are defeated. So David has had this phenomenal time of God blessing him in amazing ways. And I don't know about you, but if I've had a chapter 5 kind of week, I want to come and worship God and celebrate. And that's exactly what we see David wanting to do in chapter 6. We're told that he decides to have a celebration. He arranges for this enormous procession of 30,000 men to sing and dance as they transport the Ark of God into Jerusalem, David's new capital. All right, and we need to talk about the Ark. What is the Ark? During the time of the Exodus, some centuries earlier, God commanded his people to build a box, a wooden box. completely covered in gold. Inside the box, they were to place the 10 Commandments and a number of other significant artifacts to remember God rescuing them from Egypt. And on top of the box, there was a lid. Carved onto the lid were 2 angels with outstretched wings. And they believed that between these wings is where the presence of God himself dwelt on earth. Therefore, the ark was considered the most sacred and holy object in all the world. It represented the presence of God himself with his people. Because of its sacredness, its holiness, the set-apartness of God, he commanded that no one was ever allowed to touch this box. Not a priest, not the king, not even an animal. Nobody could touch this box. If they did, they would die. So how do you move a box that you can't touch? Thankfully, the Lord gave instructions on how to do that. He told them when they built this ark to put 4 golden rings on the sides, through which could be inserted 2 long wooden poles. And then the ark was to be lifted and carried on those wooden poles on the shoulders of priests. If you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, like that actually has a fairly good representation of what the ark looked like. Yeah, you've seen it. That's fairly accurate. So it was to be carried on the shoulders of priests. So David wants to bring this ark into Jerusalem because it represents the presence of God himself. And he's going to do it with singing and dancing and celebration because of all the blessings that God has brought to David in chapter 5. For me, this beginning of the story, this celebration, the procession, all of that sort of represents a very common way that the American church tends to view God. We view him as the one who brings blessings to us. He's the one who gives us a chapter 5 kind of life. He helps us advance. He overcomes our problems. He gives us new things to be blessed by. And like I said, if you've had that kind of experience with God, if you've had that kind of week, it's very natural to come into a place like this and celebrate and sing and lift your voice. The opposite can also be true. If you've had a really crummy week, it can be a lot harder to be motivated to come in and celebrate God. I heard that here in Omaha, if Nebraska loses on Saturday, church attendance tends to dip on Sunday. So you know what I'm talking about. When we feel God's goodness and blessings, it's natural to want to celebrate, just as David did, and it's natural to want to sing and praise his name. There's a blog post, or a blog that I used to go to more frequently than I do now, but I found it fascinating. It's called StuffChristiansLike.net. Any of you guys heard of that? It's kind of popular, written by a character named John Acuff. Stuff Christians Like lists and kind of pokes fun at some of the oddities of the evangelical subculture in the United States. And he lists different characteristics of the church world that you might be familiar with and has fun with it. So let me give you a couple of examples. Stuff Christians Like number 116, using "let me pray about it" as a synonym for no. Right? You get a lot of practice with that at church. Would you like to serve in the nursery? Let me pray about it. Right? Number 235, Stuff Christians Like number 235, confessing things around campfires. I joked in the earlier service, we're not a very sacramental tradition, but you put a campfire and people just start confessing things, right? Number 176, giving open flames to children on Christmas Eve. That always scares me. I don't trust my kids with it. Stuff Christians Like number 11, Thomas Kincaid paintings. Stuff Christians Like number 46, super happy shiny Christian radio. Stuff Christians Like number 437. This is the one I want to focus on. Living better. He has better in quotes. This is what John writes about it. He says, "My bookshelf is littered with self-help books about focus and attitude and purpose and drive. I think a lot about changing my thoughts and trying to fix the way I look at the world and how I can improve myself. I want God to slightly improve or enhance my life as well. Sometimes I act like the Bible is a self-help book. I treat it like a self-help book for a better marriage, a better attitude at work, and an easier life." I think John is beginning to capture a lot of the way we think about God. He goes on to say that we see him as the almighty improver. Life's not terrible, but he can make it better. I'm doing okay, but there's some areas I need help with, and that's where I call on God to rescue me, to help me out. I could really use Jerusalem, and he'll give me that, and I could really get rid of these Philistines, and he'll help me do that. He's the almighty improver. He brings blessing and goodness, and he certainly does. But if that's the only dimension by which we see God, that he just brings good things into my life, and that's his whole purpose, if that's all we see, then it would make sense that our worship would only have a single dimension: celebration, joy, singing. No more depth, no more complication to it. That's all there is. David's vision of God at the beginning of chapter 6 is almighty improver. Look at the blessings and good things he has brought to me. And so we see his worship at the beginning of chapter 6 is celebratory, an acknowledgement of God's goodness. And he wants God near to him. But when you look more closely at the details in the story, you discover something important. Look at verse 3. It says that David had moved the ark by putting it on a cart that was being pulled by oxen. It's a small detail, but it's really, really important. Because remember, God had commanded that this ark, this most holy object that represented his own presence, was only supposed to be transported with poles carried on the shoulders of priests. But here, David apparently ignored that instruction. It's easier, it's more convenient to just put it on a cart and have animals pull it. So David's worship was full of celebration, and it's full of an expression of God's goodness, but notice that it's somewhat casual, even flippant about God's holiness. He doesn't really see clearly that side of God's character, that other aspect of who he is, and so it's completely absent in the way he's worshiping, and it leads to a tragedy. Look at verse 6. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. Nothing kills a party like the wrath of God. Right? This celebration just stops right there. And think about it. Was Uzzah really trying to be irreverent? Was it a premeditated and deliberate act to disregard God's holiness by reaching out and touching the ark? No. It was for a good reason. This guy's got it down front. The oxen stumbled. The cart shakes. The ark is about to slip off and crash to the ground. This most holy object, the presence of God himself, probably without even thinking. Just instinctively, Uzzah reaches out to stop it from falling. And for that, God strikes him dead? Really? This is one of those stories that gives the Old Testament a bad reputation. I'm not here to give you some elaborate explanation, some theological whatever about God's holiness and sacred space and profane space and all that in order to explain why Uzzah died. I don't believe that's the point of this story. In fact, if this story makes you really uncomfortable, if this isn't the kind of story that you'd immediately whip out and share with your non-Christian friends about, this is who I worship. If this makes you uneasy, in fact, if it makes you angry, you're probably closer to understanding the intent of this story than the person who can give you an elaborate theological explanation. It's supposed to make you angry. It's supposed to make you upset. Because that's exactly how David responded. Look at verse 8. David was angry because the Lord had burst forth against Uzzah. David was angry. He no longer had confidence in this God that he thought he knew. Hey, you just made me king over Israel. You've given Jerusalem into my hands. You've defeated my enemies. You bring sunshine and rainbows. You're supposed to bring happy days and blessing. And you kill my friend Uzzah for an innocent mistake? David wasn't so sure anymore about this God whose presence he wanted with him in Jerusalem. And we're told that his anger, by verse 9, has turned to fear. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. David's joyful celebration ended like that. The God he thought was just there to bring blessing turned out to be a God far more mysterious and powerful and unpredictable than he had thought. And so, not sure if he could have this God near him or if he even wanted this God near him, David literally puts him aside at Obed-Edom's house, the Gittite's house, leaves him there and proceeds on to Jerusalem without the ark. Stephen Fry is a popular comedian and actor in the UK. He's not as well known on this side of the pond, but he's very popular over there. And he's also a very outspoken and well-known atheist. Back in January, he was interviewed on a program for the BBC called The Meaning of Life. This program interviews different celebrities, politicians, and asks them, how do you see the world? What is your organizing philosophy? And gets kind of behind what motivates their lives. The interviewer, knowing that Stephen Fry was a committed atheist, asked him an interesting question. He said, if you died and discovered that God is real, what would you say to him? The clip where Fry answers the question had been edited and put up on YouTube earlier this year, and it's gotten tens of millions of views. It's just huge. I want to read for you a bit of Fry's answer to what he would say to God if he discovered he existed. Fry said, "How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-spirited, stupid God who created a world which is so full of injustice and pain?" And then Fry went on to talk about some of those injustices and those pains, like childhood bone cancer and parasites that infect people's eyes and all kinds of other things. For Stephen Fry, the pain of this world, the injustice of this world, the brokenness of this world is enough for him to say God doesn't exist, and if he does, he must be a monster. I think the popularity of his video clip of this interview isn't just because atheists love the fact that one of their own is calling out God as a terrible monster. I think that Stephen Fry is tapping into something which, frankly, a lot of us are hesitant to admit. And that is, we don't completely understand God or his ways. We don't have a perfectly summed up explanation for everything that happens in this world. We don't have it all figured out. We don't know why certain things happen to some people and not to others. We don't know why there's certain evils and not others. And it's a complicated, mysterious thing. And sometimes it provokes in us, like David, anger. And sometimes it provokes in us fear. Came across an interesting statistic. Research says that about 80%, roughly 80% of Americans have a theistic view of God. That means they believe God exists, they believe he created the world, they believe that he is a personal being, not like an impersonal force like the Buddhists believe or Star Wars or something, but an actual person who can be related to, and he's actively engaged in the world, 80%. And yet, on any given weekend, only about 12 to 15% of Americans will actively worship God. So how do you explain the gap between 80% of us believing that he's real and exists and engaged in the world, but only 12 to 15% of us worshiping him? Well, I think a lot of Americans end up doing what David did. We end up looking at the world and the pain and the struggles and the injustices, or we look at the things happening in our own lives on a very deeply personal level, and we conclude, all right, this God may exist, but I'm not sure of his goodness. I'm not convinced he's on my side, and so we just kind of put him aside. We leave him metaphorically at the Gittite's house. I think that's part of the reason Stephen Fry's answer resonated with millions and millions of people, even those who believe in God, because he was articulating a question, an anger, a fear that many of us hold to but are scared to admit. A couple of years ago, I was invited to New York City for a meeting with 10 or 12 other Christian leaders. And the night before the meeting, we all gathered for dinner at a nice restaurant overlooking Central Park. And our host over that wonderful meal invited us to one by one share our stories. Fascinating conversation. But one of the themes that came out from all of us was that at some point or another, we all experienced a profound season of doubt. Of doubting either God's presence or at least his goodness. And for all of us, the doubt wasn't rooted in reading some deep philosophical book or, being persuaded by Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens or some other atheist writer. The doubts were rooted in profound pain, personal loss, a fear, a struggle. Like the psalmist, it was a season where we would cry out, "Where are you, God?" So we have these two visions of who God is. There's the popular vision advanced by a lot of the American church, which says God is the almighty improver. He's the chapter 5 God who brings blessings and goodness and happy days and sunshine into your life. And with that one dimension of who God is, we say, hey, celebrate, praise, sing his praises every Sunday, every weekend. And we tend to ignore the other side, which is the one that's dominated in our culture, which says this world is messed up. It's broken. There's evil, there's injustice, we don't make sense of it, we can't understand it. It also infects our personal lives and our relationships and our homes and our families, and we don't get it. And maybe this God, if he does exist, I don't know if he's good. He's mysterious. I can't make sense of him. And so a lot of our culture has this hyper reverence which says, I don't even want to go near him. I'm not going to go there. I'm going to just leave him to the side. And think about it. If you're over here questioning God's goodness, racked with pain, fear, anger, like David was, if you're standing here and you look at the church over there, what are you going to conclude? They're fake. They're not being honest. They're not being real about their doubts and their struggles and their pains. They're just painting it all with a facade of chapter 5. And if you're standing over here, if you've genuinely experienced God's blessings and goodness in your life, and you're full of joy and celebration, and you look at the culture over there, what are you going to conclude? Killjoys, negative, God just hasn't opened their eyes. And you kind of dismiss them as not having an accurate or good view of who God is. And so there seems to be this huge gulf, widening even, between the questions and doubts and fears of the culture and the joys and the blessings and the happiness of the church. So my question is, are there more than just these two single dimensions? These two simple ways of viewing God and either worshiping him or ignoring him? Is there another way? I think in David's story we see that there is. Eventually, we're told after 3 months of the ark staying at the Gittite's house, David gets word about what's happening there. Verse 11, we read this. Now King David was told, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God. So David went down and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. Okay, so here's what appears to be going on. Uzzah dies because of his irreverent act of touching the ark, and David says, I don't know what to do with this God anymore. He's unpredictable, he's dangerous. David leaves him at the Gittite's house. 3 months pass by. David's in Jerusalem without the ark, but word comes to him and says, remember how you left the ark there at the Gittite's house? Well, God's blessing that guy's house and his family, and we don't know what those blessings are, we don't know what they were, but it provokes David's memory that he had lost sight of that part of God's character and realizes, yeah, this God is good. He has blessed me. I do want his presence with me in Jerusalem. You know, sometimes when we're in that dark place of fear and anger and questioning God's goodness, what we desperately need is a sister or brother to come alongside and remind us, I know you're in the valley, but let me help you see a glimpse again of God's goodness. That's what happens with David. And so he decides, let's bring the ark up again. Let's give it another run. And what we find is really interesting. He again calls a processional with thousands and thousands of people, and there's again music and rejoicing and celebration. Look at verse 15. We're told that David danced before the Lord with all of his might, while he and the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and with the sound of trumpets. It looks a lot like the first time, doesn't it? There's celebration, there's music, there's dancing, it's joyful, but there's a difference. Look at verse 13. There's some details here you can't overlook. Verse 13 says that when those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, David sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. 2 details I want to point out for you here. First, it says that the ark was being carried. It wasn't riding in a cart being pulled by oxen. It was being carried with poles on the shoulders of priests, the way God had instructed. David is showing reverence for God. He's acknowledging the power of God. He learned his lesson. My worship can be joyful, it can be celebratory, but it dare not be casual or flippant about who this God is. I'm going to do it the way he called me to. That's the first detail. Here's the second. It says that after 6 steps, David sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. Now, the translation's a little ambiguous here. Some scholars think that a better translation from the Hebrew is that every 6 steps, David sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. Every 6 steps, stopping and offering a sacrifice to God. I know we don't think about animal sacrifices anymore. That was an Old Testament kind of thing, an ancient Near Eastern thing where people would sacrifice their wealth through the presence of their animals. That's where they kind of had their wealth, and offered it to God. It's a sign of great humility before God, a way of honoring God. So what I want you to notice is this time around, David's worship has grown. It's not just one-dimensional. It's not just celebration over God's goodness. Now, there is still celebration over his goodness, but there is also reverence in the face of God's holiness. There is celebration, but there is sacrifice. Now, just so you realize, this isn't merely an Old Testament idea. We find in the New Testament as well instruction to worship God with reverence and awe. The writer of Hebrews tells us in chapter 12 to offer God an acceptable worship with reverence and awe. And he links this reverence and awe to our vision of who God is. He says, "For indeed our God is a consuming fire." Do you realize the power that you are encountering in worship? Or are you casual and flippant because you only see God through one dimension? And remember, we see this happen in our vision of who Jesus is as well. We're told in Scripture that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, in whom all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. But very often, because of our cultural bias or just our blind spots, we focus in on the meekness of Jesus, the gentleness of Jesus, the Jesus who welcomes the children to him. The one who says, my burden is light, my yoke is easy. And that's all there, and that's all accurate, and that's all good, and that should all provoke us to celebrate. But we tend to overlook those verses that talk about Jesus' power, of the ferocious nature of his character, of the things that make us a little uncomfortable. Like the fact that people often fell down on their faces before him when they caught a glimpse of his true character. Peter, after the miraculous catch of fish, falls down in front of Jesus and says, "Get away from me, I am unworthy to be in your presence, for I'm a sinful man," very much echoing Isaiah's vision of God in the temple in Isaiah chapter 6. Later on, when Peter, James, and John go up the mountaintop with Jesus and they see him transfigured into light, they fall before him. When John sees a vision of Jesus at the beginning of Revelation, he says he falls like a dead man before him because of his power. When they're in the boat in the storm on the Sea of Galilee, we're told that the disciples were frightened by the storm because they thought they were going to drown. And then you remember the story. Jesus wakes up, speaks to the storm, says, "Be still," and immediately the waters are quiet and the wind stops blowing. The writers of the Gospels use the same word, frightened, that they had applied to the storm, but now it says the disciples were exceedingly frightened, not of the storm, but of the dude in the boat with them. Who is this guy? We don't talk about that side of Jesus very much because he's not the kind of Jesus you paint on the nursery wall. He's the dangerous God who's unpredictable and unfathomable. And yet they're both important. Because when we take together both sides of who God is, this good, loving, kind, gentle, blessing God with the unpredictable, dangerous, ferocious, holy, reverent God, that's when our worship takes on multiple dimensions. Celebration, yes, but with reverence. Sacrifice, yes, and also celebration. Let me read for you something that Annie Dillard wrote many years ago about her observations of the way the church in her days worshiped. She said, "Why do people in churches seem like cheerful, brainless tourists on a package tour? Does anyone have the foggiest idea what sort of power we are invoking? It's madness to wear ladies' straw hats and velvet hats to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews. For the sleeping God may wake someday and take offense, or he may draw us out to where we can never return." How does your vision of God inform the way you worship him? Some of you, no doubt today, have had a chapter 5 kind of week of God showing up in beautiful blessings. And so you come here wanting to celebrate and lift your voice to him. I have no doubt, though, that there are some of you who are having chapter 6 kind of weeks, wondering, "God, where are you? Why did you allow that to happen? You don't make sense to me right now." I want to suggest that we need one another. Those of us who tend to overemphasize God's goodness at the expense of his holiness need to be reminded we don't have it all figured out. He is a mystery. He is a consuming fire beyond our ability to control. And those of us who are in the valley, in the darkness, in the doubt, and in the despair, we need to remember from our brothers and sisters the goodness of God, his kindness and his blessing. And together offer worship that reflects all of who God is. He's not a one-dimensional being, but a multi-dimensional God. And guess what? You are a multi-dimensional person. Very rarely are we just happy or just sad, just full of celebration or just full of doubts. We are a mess like David, who was celebrating God's goodness, but also had his fears and his anger. I mentioned this back in the summer when we talked about Psalm 51. But in John 4, Jesus says the Father desires those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. And that idea of truth is not just truth about who God is. It isn't just having the right doctrines about God. It's worshiping him out of the truth of who we are. Bringing our joy, our happiness, our excitement, but also bringing our fears, our doubts, our questions, our pain. That's what you see in the Psalms. The whole gamut, every facet of the human-divine relationship, what you see is three-dimensional people worshiping a three-dimensional God. I think if we do that, if we're honest about who we are and we're honest about who God is, then the world will look at the church and go, "Wow, there's something there that we need." There's an honesty there about the pain we're experiencing, but also a hope in the goodness of the God who's nonetheless with us. Let me end with a brief story from C.S. Lewis that many of you are probably familiar with that I think gets at these multiple dimensions of who God is and the multidimensional response we're to have. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, his children's book, there's these 4 children who end up in this mystical land of Narnia where animals talk, and it's interesting analogy for a lot of what happens in our world. And there's this king named Aslan who really represents Jesus in the story. And the children are with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, and they're about to meet the king, to meet Aslan. And they just discover through Mr. and Mrs. Beaver that Aslan is in fact a lion. And Susan says, "Oh, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion." "That you will, dearie, and make no mistake," said Mrs. Beaver. "If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly." "Then he isn't safe," said Lucy. "Safe?" said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver's telling you? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's the king, I tell you." Likewise, our God is not safe. He is a consuming fire beyond our control or comprehension. But we know this through Jesus. He is good. Let's bring both of those things into our vision of God and our worship of him. Let me pray. Our Father, consider it amazing that you can care about the lives and the words of mere people, but we know that you do. I pray for those here who have experienced your kindness and your blessing, that they would celebrate that truly, but that they would also share those stories with others so that they might be encouraged and reminded of your kindness, your goodness. Lord, I pray for those here who are struggling to see that, who question your presence and your goodness, who only see your power, the mystery of who you are and how you operate. Give us compassion toward those people, both here and throughout our culture. And may we remember that you are beyond our control. Bless this community, I pray, with a full vision of who you are, that they might carry you in your fullness to this world that desperately needs you. We pray this in the name of Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit as one God, now and forever. Amen.